My name is Eric Williams, and I'm Curator of Religion for the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. On behalf of the museum's director, Director Kevin Young, and the museum's Associate Director of Curatorial Affairs, Dr. Dwandalyn Reece, I invite you to the 7th installation of the museum's God Talk series, the Hip Hop Edition. One of the urgent debates within the study of both African American religion and African American cultural studies is a debate that raged between the Howard University sociologist E. Franklin Frazier and the Northwestern University anthropologist Melville Herskovits. The nature of the debate surrounded this question of African retentions within the New World context. What exactly was held on to by the Africans that survived the Middle Passage? One of the things that we know is that these very powerful musical forms and these very powerful rhetorical forms survived, and we see it in so much of African American culture, from traditions of preaching and from poetry, but also in the tradition of hip hop. As a very powerful spiritual and musical modality, hip hop raises serious questions regarding the holy and the profane. It raises serious questions about Black suffering and Black hope. But it also raises questions for us around the issue of protest and praise. And so tonight, as we hear from the different presenters, the artists, the activists that will share tonight, let us be open to hearing in new ways of learning, new ways of seeing, as we lean in and as we are carried to the issues surrounding hip hop and religion.
It's an act, they provoke, we react. No complaints, I'm a flame, light a match. Ready to ascend like the Bronx in the past. Treat a box like a mat, lay it flat, spin the track, make up rap. Move like you can't trust the living. We hustle to make a living, cause nothing is ever given. Prison is what you live in when your thoughts have been conditioned. But soon you'll see, we are free. Ay. Free, we are free.
Good evening and welcome to God Talk 2.0 Hip Hop and Black Faith. I'm your host, Teddy Reeves. This conversation is presented by the Center for the Study of African American Religious Life at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. We're live in New Orleans at Studio B for what promises to be a dynamic conversation about the relationship between hip hop and Black faith. You can follow along with the conversation on social media by using the hashtag Smithsonian Hip Hop, hashtag God Talk, hashtag Black Faith, and at the museum at NMAAHC on Twitter and on Facebook. Let's jump right into the conversation by introducing our panelists for this evening. First, we have Neelam. Hakim is a Seattle-born, LA-based rapper, spoken word artist, and modern fashion influencer and activist. Her work helps center marginalized and oppressed voices within the Muslim community and larger communities. Dr. Emmett Price III is a writer, scholar, educator, minister, and trained musician. He currently serves as the Dean of Africana Studies at Berklee College of Music, and he's the author of Hip Hop Culture. Dr. Dwandalyn Reece is a trained musician and ethnomusicologist. She currently serves as an Associate Director for Curatorial Affairs at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. Most recently, Dr. Reece served as the producer of the Smithsonian Anthology of Hip Hop and Rap. Brandon BMike Odums is a New Orleans-based visual artist, activist, filmmaker, and creator of Studio B. Through film, exhibitions, and public mural work, he engages and challenges communities in dialogue at the intersections of art and activism, one spray can at a time. Big Freedia is a hip-hop artist, author, and reality TV star. Born and raised in New Orleans, Big Freedia is affectionately known as the Queen of Bounce. She is also the author of the critically acclaimed self-memoir, Big Freedia, God Save the Queen Diva. Reverend Michael Wortham is an ordained minister, educator, and activist with hip-hop sensibilities. In 2017, Reverend Mike rallied in Atlanta, Georgia to host the Trap Church as a response to the socioeconomic issues within the African American community. Sa-Roc is a DC-born rapper. Her latest album, The Sharecropper's Daughter, is a sonic reflection on generational inheritance of trauma and triumph that shapes our humanity and influences the way we see the world. Dr. Khabeer is an activist, scholar, artist, and author of Muslim Cool, Race, Religion, and Hip Hop in the United States. She also serves as the director of the Arab and Muslim American Studies program at the University of Michigan. D1 is a New Orleans-based rapper and educator. In 2022, he released his latest album, Finding Balance. Additionally, D1 released a new podcast, Mission Vision with D1, where he explores topics around spirituality, love, money, and more. Dr. Erika Gault is an assistant professor in the Africana Studies program at the University of Arizona. She's the author of Networking the Black Church, Digital Black Christians, and Hip Hop. And finally, Dr. Besheer Mohamed is the senior researcher at the Pew Research Center. He specializes in studying religious minorities in the US with a specific focus on Muslim Americans. Thank you all again so much for joining us tonight for this dinner conversation. We are going to eat, we are going to fellowship, we are going to laugh, and we're going to talk about something that is very important to each and every one of you around the table. So again, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to start our conversation off tonight by posing this question to Besheer to really ground us, to better understand what's going on in Black religion in America right now. Besheer, what is the data saying around Black participation in organized religion?
So what the data says about Black faith, Black religion, is that Black Americans, especially compared to other races, are highly religious. The overwhelming majority say they believe in God or some other higher power. Most of them say that they pray regularly. Many say that religion is very important in their lives. But that isn't to say that the religion of today, the Black faith of today, is the same as it was a generation ago. So, for example, I'll just take one. Black Americans now are less likely to identify as Christian than they were a generation ago. They're more likely to identify as Muslim or some other non-Christian faith, and they're also much more likely to be religiously unaffiliated. And so what we see is that Black faith is evolving, and it's changing, but it's also enduring and remaining present.
So what is this meaning on a broader scale for Black religion?
I mean, I think what it means is that Black religion is here to stay. It's been here for a long time. People continue to look toward it for guidance, for support, for help. But Black Americans also say that, especially younger folks, say that they have real concerns about Black churches, about houses of worship in general, about organized religion. There are disconnects between young people and their leadership on a whole variety of issues, especially around LGBT issues, on gender issues more broadly, on a whole host of things. We see that that younger Blacks really have concerns about where their religious institutions are, but on the other hand, they're not ready to just completely give up on them. So we see that when we ask people questions like, do you want to see Black churches, Black houses of worship more involved or less involved in the Black community? And very few Black people say that they want to see Black churches less involved. They want to see the houses of worship less involved. So they want to see them involved. They're looking for them for support. They're looking for them to take on that role, but in a very specific way.
Thank you. See, I'm eating already, Besheer. This is good. I want to go to you, Emmett, and really to ground the conversation in thinking about why hip hop and religion. Why this conversation? This is a conversation we could be having on jazz, we could be having on blues, but what is different about hip hop and religion? In that relationship? And then I want to open that up to others.
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, before I respond to your question, thank you for having us. I think as Big Freedia said, there's so much Black brilliance around this table. It's awestrucking, so thank you for aggregating us. Hip hop is an interesting paradox because if we were looking at the 1940s or the 1950s, you're right, we would be talking about jazz, right? A black cultural expression grounded in the black experience of domestic African Americans, Afro-diasporic peoples, who understood how to take their traumas and create hopes out of that, who understood how to take the challenges and the things that we had endured and create possibilities from that. And that music and that art form around that, including the dance and all the theatrics and poetics around that, went global, right? So even during World War II, you had jazz musicians who were in the various service corps who were playing music in Europe even while they were fighting. And in certain jazz clubs around the world, fighting stopped so that both sides of the war could listen to the music. So if we were talking about the 1940s and 1950s, it would be jazz. But hip hop was the only form of music where the elders did not lead. It was the young people, right? Because the elders were offering solutions that in our young minds, they didn't work for y'all, they ain't gonna work for us. So through the power of self-determination, we decided, young people, to take matters in our own hands, right? In the boroughs of New York City and then expanding from there, right? All the way down here to New Orleans and Los Angeles, where I'm from, and across, And so you have young people influenced, inspired, created, right? FUBU, for us, by us. And then you have the fact that as young people, we are spiritual beings. Regardless of your pathway or faith journey, we understand that we are part of an energy ecosystem that is bigger than us, right? So I want to delineate between spirituality and religion. Spirituality is our unique individual connectivity to that bigger thing. Religion is how we systematize it so that we can share in that conversation, in that dialogue. So black faith is in between those, right? There are multiple strands and streams and opportunities. And so in that situation, hip hop was born within a spiritual sphere because the trauma that we were suffering, the only way that we was gonna get through it was because there was a bigger power, right? So from broken glass everywhere until your most current rhyme, there's always this definitive notion, whether you talking about DMX, who can talk about some stuff, but there was always, oh, thank the Lord that, there's always this, interlude that is a faith-driven thing. So the challenge here is that the black church is always playing catch-up. And I mean the black church in the most ecumenical sense. Black faith is always playing catch-up because it defines itself in response to a bigger religious system that has been owned and dominated by a Eurocentric, shall I say, white narrative. So the black church, and by extension black faith, is tending to respond to this, which means that we're not only behind what we young people are dealing with, but we're also behind what they are dealing with, right? So this kind of civil rights aesthetic, civil rights understanding in the hip hop age, that's not gonna work. And it didn't work. So this conversation is extremely important because now we have multiple generations of hip hoppers, not all agreeing, not all seeing the world and experiencing the world the same way, and yet all of us believe that there is a better day coming. There is a hope, there's a resilient possibility of future, and so this conversation is imperative.
Awesome. Dwan, I'm going to sketch over to you because I think it's a great point to ground the book, right? The Smithsonian released the Hip Hop Anthology, which really is the impetus for this conversation that we're having tonight. In thinking about this anthology, what was the mission and the purpose around it? And in thinking about spirituality as a whole, how does it play and ground itself in the work of the anthology?
Sure, I can talk a little bit about that. And I want to thank Dr. Price for his comments because it was an aha moment for me in working on this project. The project, we'd like to say this is from the ground roots. We have Smithsonian Folkways, which is the record label. The Smithsonian Institution has a long history built on Moses Ashe collection and has done Bernice Johnson Reagan, Wade in the Water. So the National Museum of African American History and Culture has a series with Smithsonian Folkways, and it's called the African American Legacy Series. So there, like minds are talking a lot. There had always been an interest, or a long-standing interest at Folkways of thinking about hip hop as a community folk-based music. Chuck D had an interest, and he said in numerous interviews that he wanted to see hip hop get the same treatment that other genres have, that you get behind the music, behind the story, because that's where you really get it and we really understand it. And the forces just kind of pulled together at the right time so that we decided to do this collaboration. What's important about this, I think, speaking for our institution, that hip hop is integrated all throughout the museum, and this is my attitude about music. It's not just a side gear. It is part of the history. It drives the history a lot of the times, and so it should be thought of in the same way. And so much of the spirit of this institution, it was built from the ground up on the shoulders of the people who formed those African American museums in the 60s. And even though we're at a national level, it wouldn't exist without everyone out there and donating $10 or bringing their objects or doing the work when no one else was interested in it. So we're very like-minded with Folkways in that regard. So the part of the project was that it was going to be a community-based project. We had 2 committees. We had an advisory committee of about 35 people who selected close to 1,000 tracks, songs, that they thought should be on an anthology. And then we put together an executive committee who drove the decision-making, selected the tracks, advised on educational, all matters on the exhibit, and they really drove the train. It was a combination of artists and scholars and industry folks. If you look at the anthology, you can see the names are, I don't want to say them because I'm afraid I'll forget somebody, but Chuck D was one of them because he was instrumental in getting this off the ground. But we worked together. I'm always taken by something MC Light said as, the hardest thing was how do you choose 129 tracks to tell the story of hip hop? And she said something at one moment when everyone was they just didn't want to make a choice. She said the important thing is, not how many records were sold or who was the best or who was that. Can a track or a song tell the story about hip hop? And it's the same attitude we take with the exhibition, is that we have well-known artists, we tell community stories, organizational stories, but it's not a Hall of Fame. It's about African American music, how it produced, how it's factored in African American life. So it's so central to the African American experience. And so we take that route. So the anthology itself is just one story. It's one story of hip hop. Any one of us, the whole audience can create their own story about the tracks. But what we're trying to do, and I'm taken about this generational difference, and I think that is the crux, is, it was so reactionary when hip hop came out. You've got the older generation, I don't understand that, and people just trying to slam it left and right, and that's kind of old there. But there is that, I think we're in a seismic shift moment. Historically, as African Americans, we've relied on religious faith, we've relied on the institutions, the civil rights movement, and the tension, and I believe we can get there, is of the youth leading. It's changing the paradigm. We respect our elders, that's part of the culture. But that doesn't mean that other people don't have anything to say, and that can lead us forward. And so what's interesting for me, aside from celebrating hip hop and telling the stories behind it, which is very important about music, it's more than just your favorite artist, what was going on in the community? How does region and place inform an artist? The industry, it's changed the music industry for African Americans and people overall, the global influence, gender, all those kind of issues. That's part of a given song that you listen to on the radio. And so we're trying to give this perspective. And I'm so happy the center took this on to do this project because we couldn't do everything in the anthology, and we really wanted to talk about spirituality. I mean, it's core to the African American experience, and hip hop I knew was central to it. And I'm glad Emmett said what he did because that was a little thing I wasn't getting a handle on. And it's just a new paradigm, and change is hard. So thank you for doing this, and I'm so happy to have this conversation. So that was a long-winded answer to your question.
It's all right. Look, we're eating up, and we're fellowship. That's right. I want to ask this question and really open this up to everyone at the table. Thanks so much, Dwan, because I think it really leads Emmett and Dwan and Besheer, it leads us into this point. Is hip-hop its own religion? Or is it a style of discipleship that points people toward faith? And kind of a follow-up to that, if it is its own religion, what is the theology of hip-hop culture? Is hip-hop in its nature prophetic, right? When we think about religion and we think about faith and we think about all of those things, there's a prophetic nature to it. So is hip-hop its own religion? And if so, what's the theology behind it? And I invite anyone to jump in. Absolutely, come on in.
Just because I actually have a slightly different narration of hip-hop history with religion. You know, I work on the relationship between hip-hop and Islam, and particularly Black Islam, right? The ways in which Islam is practiced amongst Black people in the diaspora. And so while I agree that hip-hop has definitely had been youth-led, I think that it's very much rooted, right? And if we think about someone like Malcolm X, right, who's always, like one of the first hip-hop tracks, right, is like Malcolm X, No Sellout. So this idea, and you're right, not the civil rights movement, but the Black Power movement, right? So I feel like when we think about hip hop, and even this idea of the Black church being behind, maybe Black Christianity was behind, right? But I very much see that when you talk to people who were like, you know, there in the early days and what their influences by Malcolm, the Nation of Islam, these kind of things, Black Islam, were very much a part of how they began to, you know, articulate and interpret and understand, right? Like what it is, what are we living with that we're now going to rhyme about or dance about or write about, right, in that kind of way. So I think, so in that sense, I feel like, is hip hop its own religion? I mean, I think it can be, right? I think that it can do that kind of work, but in the way I see it, I often see it as sort of like a pathway, right? And particularly, again, in my context in terms of Islam, like it's like the kinds of things you want to learn about, the kinds of sort of ways you want to resist, right? Like you come into hip hop, right? You hear a song, someone tells you something, right? And then it kind of leads you on this path of knowledge of self, right? The fifth element, right? You kind of gain this knowledge of self, and that might lead you to maybe a particular spiritual tradition, or, and I like, there's another scholar, Monica Miller, she talks about hip hop being promiscuous, right? So you might lead you to become Muslim or a 5%er or like a Rasta, or it might lead you to kind of be doing a lot of different stuff at the same time. That's what I would say.
Awesome, thank you, D.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say, I don't think hip hop is a religion in and of itself because there's no universal God that exists inside of hip hop. That's right. You ask everybody who's their favorite rapper or who's the most influential rapper of all time, you'll get a bunch of different answers. Same thing, there's no universal text inside of hip hop. An album that really spoke to someone or an album that really raised a generation like Illmatic or like 400 Degrees if you're from down here in New Orleans, that might just be specific to a certain city or a certain time frame. And I don't think there's anything like the Holy Quran or like the Bible that exists in hip hop that's universally accepted and decided upon. It's all just very opinion based. In terms of it being an effective form of communication, definitely hip hop allows messages to be communicated that pastors can't get through by just preaching. Hip hop allows messages to be communicated that teachers can't get through to their students, their professors can't get through, their parents can't even get through to their children. So hip hop is definitely effective as a train, as a carrier of messages, but I think that it's leading people to things like God, to religion, instead of it being a religion.
I'll even jump in on that and might even say it's religion-ish. So like if I was to kind of piggyback off of what Emmett said in regards to like this delineating between spirituality and religion, when you talk about a systematic approach to it. So when you talk about the different elements, so when you talk about MCing, when you talk about DJing, when you talk about breaking, when you talk about b-boy and b-girl and breakdancing, and I'm missing one, graffiti, and you talk about art, and then you talk about throwing the fifth, the knowledge of self, you could throw in a sixth when you talk about fashion. Like there are ways to where you can kind of systematize, in a sense, what hip hop can look like. So and you can find your space to get in it. And within that, you can see like, okay, this is hip hop. And then when you talk about different regions, how it can sound different in New Orleans, it can sound different in LA, it can sound different in New York, it can sound different in Alabama. Just gonna throw Alabama in there because I'm from there. But I'll throw Atlanta in there. Like it can sound different, it has different variations in the same way with our different faith traditions. It really, Christianity, you could be a Protestant, different types of Protestants. You could be AME, you could be CME, you could be Baptist, and they have their own ways of doing it. If you're Islam, you could be Sunni, you could be Shiite, you could be part of the Nation of Islam, you could be 5%. It's like there are different ways that it can be expressed, but there are still like these kind of core pieces within it that when you see it, you know it. So like when you go to the other side of the world, I went to Turkey in 2015 and I saw graffiti all over the place. I'm like, hip hop really did make it this far. Mm-hmm. You go to Japan and see what's happening with youth out there. You go all these different places in the world to see that the elements, in a sense, the religion of it or the religionish of it or the systems of it are still in play and intact, but it can have different expressions across the board. So, and then when we get into the theology piece of it, like I said, there's probably ain't no express like God, but there we definitely talk about God. I think conversations about God and what God looks like has been probably in hip hop since day one. And whether it's our frustration with God, is whether God just getting us through the day before we go hit the trap, like just however it goes, God is there. Mm-hmm. And because in a lot of respects, most black folk grew up in somebody's church. Somebody grandma dragged them to church. They grabbed them to the mosque. They'd have been in the space. Mm-hmm. And some of that begins to rub off. And some of that stays, some of it you critique, but I think that's why I say religion-ish. It may not be like this formal thing per se, but there are things that are markers to let you know like this is hip hop when you see it.
Yeah, and I agree with him because there are a lot of spiritual faiths that don't have one unifying text, but when we think about like the written word, what exactly is that? When we think about visual artists and also artists within the literary genre, including, hip hop, receiving like epiphanies and stuff when we're writing, or when I think about my writing, I feel like, the ancestors whispered this to me, or the angels whispered this to me. And if we think about the older definition or the religious definition of epiphany, is the embodiment of the divine. Yeah. And in that way, we can say that hip hop is prophetic in a way. It could be a polytheistic religious faith, a polytheistic religious faith, if you will, if we're likening hip hop artists to gods in a sense, but I would think of us more as like prophets, if you will. And just the idea that many artists have had, supporters come up to us and say like, this song or these words saved my life, or I feel like church when I'm listening to this. You know what I mean? So like, it's a matter of how the text is interpreted and how the text allows the listener and the artists themselves to tap into that, connective energy that, that we all have access to. We are able to download in our own unique way. So, that's just my little take on it.
And just to piggyback off of that, hip hop is a big form of self-expression. And exactly what you were just saying, it's all about the artist or the person who's giving the message. A lot of people tell me when they come to a Freedia show, they felt like they came to a bounce revival, or, they felt some type of spirit come into the room. So I really think that it's about the artist that's telling the message. D1, you always talk about God in a lot of your songs. You express yourself and put the word in everything that you do as well. So I connect with my higher being no matter what I do. Before my shows, I pray all the time. Me and my team is a thing that we normally do. So it's about, just you connecting one-on-one, having that personal relationship, in every type of genre of music, not just hip hop, So it's all about your connection with God to me. No matter what you do, music, art, hip hop, jazz, bounce, whatever. It's all about that true connection to your higher being.
That's super powerful what Freedia just said, because when you think about the power that artists have inside of hip hop, I would say hip hop is not a religion. Hip hop is a pastor, because hip hop is what people use to get closer to God. So people are consuming the art that these artists, that we as artists are creating, and they're saying, hey, that helped me, that helped me get through whatever it is that I'm going through. So hip hop to me is the vehicle. It's essentially like a pastor, like I said, because you have different pastors who have different styles. The same way every artist has a different style. And with a pastor who has a unique style, they're gonna attract a unique following. Same thing with us as artists. It's like, oh, okay, as hip hop artists, we have different fans that we attract depending on what our style is. So when I think of hip hop, and I think of the fact that it's ever evolving. I think of God as being a being that is not going to change, that's immovable. I think of hip hop as something that's always evolving, always taking on new shapes and new forms, and that's what pastors do. So I think hip hop is a pastor.
I guess I would add to that in thinking about it, and some of the things around the table already is just it's diversity, how we can come to it in several different places and get different things out of it. Like, even that we have to engage the question of whether or not it is a religion, is really quite telling of the multiple things that hip hop can be. I would say first and foremost, we must think about it as this imaginative space of possibility, where you can be several things, and because of that, we engage it around religion, because what other place can we have these kinds of conversations about whether or not you're talking about this pastor or as this entry point into a certain kind of afterlife. Hip hop provides us that space, and so it sounds a lot like religion, but I think it's something much more complex and something much more imaginative about what the possibilities could be, particularly for Black people, you know, and perhaps Blackness and Black diasporic practices are really the link, to my mind, between hip hop and religion for that reason.
Yeah, I think, I was gonna add, when I used to teach a hip hop class, I used to talk about, you know, this idea of the break, right? With the break in hip hop, right? But also the break from Africa, right? And one of the breaks I think that hip hop, you know, does is this existential thing where people talking about these questions like, who am I? Who am I in the world? Why am I here? Like, what is the purpose of all these things? And even in the most like profane, to use that word, song, I think you always find that. You always find this question about existence that's always going to be there, even when the song is about something else altogether. I feel like it's this undercurrent, right, that continues within hip hop. And so I think that just reminded me of that in terms of the relationship to sort of religion and spirituality, sort of more broadly. I think that does maintain itself. And for me, that again is tied to knowledge of self. Like that's the kind of thing that's at the root that kind of follows people, artists, and also the consumers, like the fans, the people who are listening to the music.
You know, what's interesting to what you just said and the thread of this conversation is the bigness of hip hop, the notion of innovation within hip hop, and I'm gonna recalibrate that to the courage of hip hop. Because hip hop, vis-a-vis those of you who are creators, have pushed boundaries that previously were unpushed and created spaces that were previously uncreated or even unimagined. So the notion of the expression of Afrofuturism through hip hop and the reconnection of the diaspora through hip hop. So what hip hop was in the mid to late 70s is totally different than what hip hop is now in the 22s of you know, the 21st century. And I think it's a beautiful thing because it evolves in a way where our connectivity back through the diaspora, not just to the continent and not just to the Caribbean, but into Afro-Latinx spaces that bridges dispossessed people and brings us together in ways, shapes, and forms that I don't think we've experienced before. And so there is this understanding of the other spiritual dimensions, and I don't mean to otherize them, I mean to bring them into the forward frame of spotlighting them as we think about indigenous spiritual practices within the continent and the Caribbean and Afro-Latinx spaces, and we reclaim them even if we're syncretizing them with the understandings and the spiritual pathways that we know now, right? So that sense of technology, if I can use that terminology here, to create something that didn't exist already and to bring it in and to be all right with it. You know what I mean? To flip something that has never been flipped before and then to drop the mic and say, you know what? I just did a thing right there, right? Who's watching? Who's paying attention, right? And I think that piece is an innovation that we didn't see in previous generations of Blackness. That freedom to be who you are in your lived, embodied experience right now, without the notions of politics of respectability, without the notions of appropriateness, however that's defined, and to be unapologetically yourself, even as an ontological species that's always changing to become your better self. So to demark right now who I am, and then 2 days later to flip it and be like, this is who I am today, and for that to be okay. Like, that's hip hop. And I don't think you can codify that within a religion. I think it's bigger than that.
I do want to interject, and I'm playing devil's advocate or trying to get at that thing, because so much of what I'm hearing, that's the history of African American music. I mean, the freedom. And I know there's something there that, because you could talk about a lot of these things in the same way you could talk about any genre of music. It is that freedom exercise from the moment the person enslaved got here. That has been the mission. So I know hip hop's different. If I had to articulate it in the way that we're talking about it, there's something there. And I don't know if it's the technology or the sense of possibility, but as a curator, I think about this and trying to communicate it to people who don't know a lot about hip hop. And it's one thing to say it's different, but it's another thing to articulate. You can feel it, you can talk about it, but there's something crystallized that I'd love to be able to say why it's different, even though I feel it, and I'm just wondering what that is.
Well, we're in BMike's space right here. Spirituals didn't get us this space. Blues didn't get us this space. Even jazz didn't really get us this space to actually be able to flip BMike's space right here into a recording studio, with blackness all over, even the floor is black. you know what I mean? The tablecloth is black. You know what I mean? And to be amongst this black brilliance, spirituals had to happen within the cloud of what Toni Morrison talked about, the white gaze. We was always worried about how they felt about what we were doing, so we could only push it so far. Hip hop is like boom. Right, to the fact that the industry has changed the way that the industry operates based on hip hop.
I mean, is it different?
Know.
Yeah,
I'm hesitant
right. I'm like,
to say that we are somehow removed from those histories that created these liberative spaces, and that we're not doing that again. And I would really say that it is the technology because of the scale that you can do it at. And also, especially when you talk about digital technology in particular, when you talk about how quickly you can reproduce certain images and certain sounds and have a global audience. So I would take it a step further and say that, but on the just history piece, I wonder if we are really that far removed from historical diasporic practices.
Yeah, I would think you're built on the shoulders. I mean,
Okay.
Well, yeah, of course.
Okay.
Of course.
it's an extension, right?
Yeah,
It's an
of course.
extension of that. But yes, hip hop is like Black popular culture, right? It's a space of contradiction. So definitely, in the connection to sort of African American music, Afro-diasporic music, definitely, right? This way in which we express ourselves, we free ourselves, we resist. But there's still a white gaze, right? Because how many, and the artists can speak more directly to this, right? The pressures, right, that you experience, if you want to make money, right? If you want to do the pressures to be a particular kind of artist, right, is very much about a white gaze. That's the music industry. So I'm not sure, I don't feel like hip hop has escaped that in that way.
Neelam.
It's funny, I kind of have a different perspective when it comes to hip hop religion. I kind of believe that the new religion is no religion, and a lot of it is because of hip hop. I feel like the religion is get money and get popping and, just try to come up. And I know that the origins of hip hop, started with a conscious base, and a lot of, like Sis said, Islam was involved, and, the 5%ers and stuff like that. But as far as the current state, I just believe it's religious. Listen, hip hop is the rebel. And religion, most organized religion has a lot of rules and regulations that people don't really want to be dictated by. In the current, from what I observe. And I think that's why people are falling away from that. And a lot of it has to do with the rebel hip hop, in my opinion.
Well, in that case, then we got to talk about the market-driven sensibilities of a lot of organized religions. So are you just trading religions in that case? Yeah.
Right.
Capitalism.
Yeah.
So historically, and I think this goes into this question, this next question for you, in capitalism and markets, right? Historically, what have been the critiques given by hip hop artists towards religious leaders? And vice versa, what has been some of the critiques of religious leaders against hip hop artists and culture? And are those critiques valid? Is there any validity in any of the critiques going across the pews or the aisle?
Well, it's ironic because the main critique that hip hop artists typically have of religious leaders is that they're not keeping it real when they're not on stage or in the pulpit, right? But that's the same thing that hip hop artists do. Is they get on tracks and they're not keeping it real to how they're really living off the mic. So a lot of times you tend to criticize what you really are on the inside because you see yourself in someone else. A pastor is a leader, a person with a congregation, with an audience, and the hip hop artists oftentimes are like, well, he's stealing out the collection plate, or, you know, when he's not on stage, he's in the casino somewhere, he's out there running women or something like that. But like Jadakiss said, why do rappers lie in 85% of their rhymes, you know? And that song came out a while ago. I would say rappers lie in about 95% of their rhymes.
But then
Well, it
hip-hop
depends on-
artists aren't adherent to a moral code. You know, the preacher, the pastor, the imam, or whatever, they are expecting the congregation, they're expecting the followers of that faith to be adherent to the tenets of this particular religion. And they're supposed to be, in a sense, the touchstone for the congregation to look towards for morality. And that's not the case in hip hop. You know, we are free agents to speak how we want to speak, dress how we want to dress, how we want to dress, and tell our stories uninfluenced by, you know, popular narrative, or uninfluenced by, or unbeholden to a higher power, if you will. You know, we may be, like Sis said about, you know, there is an industry that expects a certain type of code, if you will, to be pushed towards a mainstream audience and to have your voices amplified. But I think it's very valid in that there is a critique of hypocrisy of some religious leaders not walking the walk. And yes, there is a huge facade there, you know, within, you know, the world of hip hop in certain spaces. But I think the expectations are rightfully different, you know.
I could keep it real, isn't it moral code?
It is a little bit. I don't think so. The type of the stuff that we claim to keep it real to, I feel like contributes to some of the downfall of our communities that we claim to, you know, be loyal to.
There's no universal definition of what real is in hip hop. So when you say keep it real, that means 10 different things to 10 different people. And if your definition of real is in fact something that's fake, then you're trying to keep it real. And the more you try to do that, you're perpetuating something that might be, you know, fake from the jump.
I think on the other side of the record, I think sometimes religion tries to have the monopoly on hope. And I think, I grew up in a household, my father's a pastor, and we were not allowed to listen to rap music. Like, that was like one of the higher level, like, punishable things. You know, I don't want to share too much, but there's a lot of stories of sneaking to listen to music. And there was this idea that, one, that there's this separation, that it's everything that's represented in those spaces is ungodlike, or it's not pointing you in the direction of salvation. But I think ultimately, when I first fell in love with hip hop, it was because I found versions of hope in the artist's words. And it reminded me that hope was not exclusive to a religious practice, that it was something afforded to any person at any moment, at any space, that they had the ability to tap into something greater and give you a message that can get you through the day. And I think sometimes religion wants you to believe, and rightfully so sometimes I could argue, that the only way to get through hope is through the connection they present to you to the Creator. It's like, this is the means in which you get hope, but hip hop has always been about meeting people where they are, and that song will get you through the day. and it might not have anything to do with religion or God, but it's that song that's gonna give you hope. And so I think that could be part of it too.
And it kind of piggyback off of BMike, like thinking about how like those critiques that the church will have saying like this is like ungodly music, like the things that they're expressing or talking about, these are sinful. Like you hear that terminology. These things probably get you, you're going to hell if you're listening. Like people will go to that extreme. The irony of that too though is like those same things that they say are sinful are things that actually occur within church spaces. When you talk about the disrespect of women in those spaces, when you talk about the violence that happens in churches, in church spaces, physical violence, mental violence, verbal violence, like those same things happen within those spaces. So it's like this weird irony and contradiction, because there's also a power dynamic too. Because when we look at the stats now, you see more and more generations pulling away from churches. When we talk about the capitalistic aspect of it, all right, we're seeing people not coming to church. That means, okay, we about to start losing some tithes. We start losing some financing. We about to start, our churches could start closing. Like there's a hope, there's a deeper rabbit hole that you can almost go down when you start looking at the power dynamics that come in that. And so these critiques become like almost a power play in a sense, like whose voice is strong enough to gather this population and bring them in and have them support their work, their art, however we want to talk about it. So I think that's another aspect of it too, when we talk about the critiques that go back and forth.
And just to follow up on you two, that was just such a good point. I just feel like it's also about delivery. The reason why people will connect to hip hop is the delivery. With organized religion, sometimes you're saying the right thing, but you're either saying it in a self-righteous way or a mean-spirited way, or we're just looking at pure hypocrisy and we just don't get it. And that's why it's so many people falling away and being like, rejecting that, but then they see, I do quotes, but realness in hip hop, and that's why they tend to be attracted to that.
One of the things we did with the anthology is kind of the larger context. So we're talking about religion and hip hop. What about what's going on all around that? Do you see that impacting the change, or what particularly? I mean, we talked about the origins of hip hop and what was going on in the 70s.
Okay, I just wanted to say one thing, which is true about religion, right? Like the tithe thing, like I don't know if there's a mosque or masjid in America that stayed alive because of tithes, right? So I feel like this question of like, we need to do that because of that. Even then, like I feel like the critique is there, but I also feel like there's a lot, if Minister Farrakhan is cited, he's one more song, right? And this idea of like a supportive, right? So there's a critique, right, of religious hypocrisy, but I also find that in hip hop music, and in particular religious figures, are actually embraced, right? And they kind of reach out and try to bring people in, right? Because they want to sort of support, and with all the contradictions, all that kind of stuff, they try to figure out, that type of thing. So I wanted to just put that on the table too, because I do think this critique is here, but it's also a really strong tradition, and particularly in terms of Muslim religious leaders, of an engagement, of a support, of a sort of like, let's do this thing, right, when it comes to hip hop.
I kind of want to piggyback off of that, because I think what we're seeing now is that when I think about those pastors, I think about people that baby boomer generation. That generation, when I was a child, those were the ones who were in leadership in church. Now you see Gen X, millennials, even some Gen Z who are leading churches who are children of hip hop. So hip hop now has this influence on them where they're able to pull people in because they appreciate the culture. They are a part of the culture. Like, because something that I did notice growing up is that when they really began to see like, okay, no, these kids really like hip hop, now they start to appropriate the culture. So they'll try to start using certain language. I'm like, oh, you don't talk like that every day, bro. Like, you don't talk like that, stop. Like, and you begin to see like this, them trying to do this. And again, you don't like the culture. You was really saying this is the devil music. Now you want to start using certain words. That don't work. But for me, I probably listen to more hip hop than I do gospel music. I got Kurt Franklin, he's cool. Kendrick, that's my guy. Jay, that was my guy. DMX, that's my guy. Like DMX drove my car, that's the homie. It's RIP. But it's like one of those things where it's like hearing them and connecting with that, and then being an ordained minister, it's like, okay, all these worlds made me and finding ways to bring this in. Being able to talk about Kendrick, I love myself, and being able to say, hey, guess what, OGs? He's sampling the Isley Brothers. Y'all like the Isley Brothers. I know y'all do because y'all played in the church parking lot. Then, and being able to bring all of that together, and when they begin to see, like, wait a minute, this is something that, this is not too far from us. But I think our generation has the ability and has done that, has been able to kind of blur those lines in an authentic way that for those that are remaining in for those reasons because they see themselves more in church than what they probably did in the past.
So I'm going to come in right here. I know this conversation is rich, but we have to go to a break. So we will be back with more of the God Talk 2.0 hip hop and Black faith conversation. Again, continue to follow us on social media using the hashtag Smithsonian Hip Hop, Black Faith, and hashtag God Talk. We'll be right back.
Peace, this is BMike, and you're watching God Talk 2.0 live at Studio B.
Who are the leaders and the current occupants of Black digital, religious, and spiritual spaces?
Pre-COVID, Black women were already in the digital trenches. Black women have always been in the spiritual trenches using, as Dr. Erika Gault would say, their spiritual technologies.
This is a kind of mixed bag. It is the best and worst of both worlds. And some of that is just the way the internet itself is structured. The internet is an anti-Black space by design. It was meant to be antithetical to Black freedom ways. And yet we find that there are several Black folks who are making a way out of no way.
Black folk have not always been digital, but Black folk have always been networked. We absolutely cannot take the same warmed over, problematic, white supremacist, patriarchal, capitalistic, misogynistic, homophobic, sexist, ableist, so forth and so on, theological precepts into digital space and call it freedom.
So in my work at Black Nonbelievers, we're dealing with we're dealing with a lot of people in spaces that may have left religion and the God concept and the church behind, but they're still carrying a lot of dogma and also the sexism, misogyny, and patriarchy that comes along with it.
How has COVID-19 changed the way you engage with your various digital communities?
In terms of COVID-19 and how we've been having to pivot and adjust, we realize now that moments quickly become memories, right? And so in this moment, it's important that you leave a memory on your audience. We've been blessed to be doing social media and living through social media for the last 15 years. So essentially what we said, the moment that COVID-19 hit, I pulled my team together and I said, listen, what would we do if this lasts longer than we think? Let's just say it lasts for 2 years. How can we cultivate and empower our audience? So what we decided to do is really pull the veil off.
The internet has actually helped me come to the place that I am in now with that, right? If I think about how we understood the divine when I was growing up, right? There was a very simple image of Jesus. There was a very simple image of like what the virtuous woman was or what it meant to be a part of a church setting. And as I found my own way in terms of spirituality, in terms of understanding that there were other folks who believed like me, and that belief didn't necessarily put us in line with the churches that we grew up in.
You know, I was a visibly Muslim woman, so I'm a Muslim woman in a scarf. I'm a practicing Muslim, you know, I'm a mother, and I talk about sex, I talk about orgasms, I talk about, you know, the importance of female pleasure. And there was a disconnect for a lot of people who were part of the religious establishment, both, you know, in Islam.
And so I think because, one, we're all more connected through social media, we have more access to virtual community, we're affirming these things in each other. It's not just like, okay, no, continue to be uncomfortable, continue to be in a place that you feel like is, kind of limiting pieces and parts of yourself. We're able to have these conversations as groups, as millennials, as communities, to encourage each other to, go into these places where they are celebrated, where they are protected, and where they are able to incubate and explore their faith, their spirituality, while also exploring themselves, because they're one and the same.
Hey, I'm Neelam, and you're watching God Talk 2.0.
Yeah, so God Talk has been a journey, needless to say. It has been an evolution of an idea to a manifestation of something that I think goes beyond whatever we could have imagined. From talent, from location, from production, the conversation has continued to grow at each location. I think what the biggest thing is, we've learned, right? After each God Talk conversation, we learn something new, whether it is the topics that we are exploring, whether it is the concepts we are exploring, whether it's the production, right? What worked, what did not work, what shots worked, what did not work, thinking about God Talk 2.0, we tried to film a conversation in the midst of a global pandemic with camera crews all over the United States. There were not many institutions, whether large or small, doing something of that feat. And so we have taken some risk in this conversation, even in the folks that we brought to the table. Right? I think the biggest thing that we have learned and the biggest thing that I think reflecting on these conversations and this series is betting on people's ability to speak their truth and giving people a table to do that. And that is not possible without production. It's not possible without the women and the men and the folks working to make this a reality. And so we've learned a lot around this conversation series. And in this one in particular, this conversation around hip hop and faith and bringing artists to the table, whether they are musical artists and visual artists and scholars to the table, is going to be a new feat for us. Man, I don't think any of us when we started this project could have imagined awards being associated with it. It was a project to really understand something that was a phenomenon, that it was something that was happening. Pew was releasing this data and really wanting to know who were the voices behind it. And so we get to this point of producing the first show, producing the second show, producing the third show, and awards kept coming. It is, I'll say this, you don't necessarily do your work for validation, for awards, right? You don't do the work to be awarded for it. You do the work because it's the work you feel that your soul has been called to do. And I think that for this project, that has been why we've done the work and why we continue to do the work. The awards are a nice icing on the cake, right? It is a nice validation to say that the work is being appreciated by a larger body of folks, that the work is making a difference in the culture, that the work is making a difference in the field.
What you need to know right now is that you need to get your copy of the Smithsonian Anthology of Hip Hop and Rap.
And I'm urging you to get yours. This is an incredible wealth of information about the culture we know and love.
It's an amazing collection of all the greatest moments in hip hop. Some of my mentors are in there.
This is a whole bunch of pages of the icons in hip hop. I'm talking about the real legends, and you're gonna see their story in live, living color.
Not only is it filled with thorough dopeness, but it will make a great gift for any friends or family.
I'm also in the book and many, many others that inspired me.
Make sure you grab that. It's right there. I know you see it.
Hip hop is self-expression. It's black. It's the culture. It's love. It's the struggle. It's pain. It's joy. It's art. It's creativity. It's everything and then some. You heard me?
You conscious, you gully, I see you.
Welcome back to God Talk 2.0, Hip Hop and Black Faith. I'm your host, Teddy Reeves. If you want to follow along with the conversation, join us on social media at NMAAHC and use the hashtag Smithsonian Hip Hop, God Talk, and Black Faith. We're going to jump back into this conversation because it is good. We have dessert on the table, and we are going to get into some more of this conversation. I want to start with you, Freedia. When I think about the hip hop anthology, it chronicles the evolution of hip hop from 1520 Sedgwick in the Bronx to its expansion to Atlanta, LA, and now New Orleans. We are sitting in New Orleans, Louisiana. And so I want to know, how does New Orleans' unique hip hop culture and sound and spirituality help inform and serve as a forerunner in how we understand hip hop and religion? And I'm thinking about in your book when you talked about bounce music being the new church. And so if you could expand on that, and then I want to hear from the New Orleans folks at the table, and then from everyone else.
You know, we have a strong history of hip hop here in New Orleans with the Cash Money, No Limit family, really expanding hip hop for the culture of Louisiana and for New Orleans. So, me growing up back early in the 80s when, early 90s when they started to come out with hip hop music and really develop their sound and get their fan base, started, New Orleans was a big support of that. My background is church. I come from the church, from the Black Baptist Church. I was a choir director for many, many years at my church home. I sung with many choirs around New Orleans. So, church is a big part of what I do. Like they say, many are called, but few are chosen. And I think that my connection from coming from the gospel world and then crossing over into the subgenre of hip hop, which is bounce music, is a big thing for me to be connected to a certain, audience in a certain space out in the world. A lot of times when, like I said previous, when people do come to a Freedia show, they think about, having this bounce up sort of revival. And like we say, the new twerk is the church. And in order to keep that connection with the fans that we are trying to, lead into a certain realm of religion, I connect just my background and my history to what I'm doing currently now. A lot of times previous, he was talking about how these different churches have to connect to the millennials. A lot of bishops, a lot of pastors I see now, especially in New Orleans, have to get on these different millennials level in order to get, to connect with them, to have them to even come to the church. So you see them incorporating hip hop music, on the yard when they're having something around the church. Or you see the pastor maybe reference a hip hop song that everybody can relate to. So these things are just really important, especially in the Black community, to keep on pushing forward to, connect people with their God, whoever their higher being, whatever that may be, and also just still enjoy life and enjoy music. Music is a great way to connect to a lot of different things and tell a lot of different stories. And I try to use my story to, embrace God in every way that I can. It's very important for me to keep my backgrounds rooted in everything I do. Like I said, before each show, we pray. Before each stage, we let the Spirit come in. I just did a show the other night and they asked me just out of the blue to pray on stage. But the Spirit that came in the room was unbelievable. It was like where 2 or 3 are gathered in the midst, God shall come in the room. So I'm a true believer in no matter what space you're in, you can put the Spirit wherever you are. Hip hop, jazz, bounce, whatever. You can incorporate God in everything you do in life.
Good. Brandon. Yeah, definitely. I mean, New Orleans, I think I would go back a little bit further and say, like, had it not been for Congo Square, we probably wouldn't have most of the music that we enjoy in this country, if not the world. I think in New Orleans, we're connected to our history in a way that sometimes is undefinable, unexplainable. But you think about Congo Square, a place in New Orleans where enslaved Africans were able to participate and continue their traditions, drumming, singing, dancing, creating art, cooking food, and how that, as a way, dropped seeds that led to spirituals and rock and roll and jazz and hip hop. So we've always done music in a very spiritual and intentional way here. Just the way you think about how bounce brings people together, how it was always like a call to action, how brass bands always was a call to action. It was less about the performer and more about the unit of people, the church that came together. And also the other point I think that I love about New Orleans music is the alchemy of it, the idea of how we've been able to transform. And that's no different from Black music across the spectrum. But here, New Orleans has so much that can be defined as negative. We have so many reasons why we're on the top of the list for all the things wrong. But yet, the things you love about New Orleans is the exact opposite. It's because we found a way to be alchemists with our pain, alchemists with our conditions that are negative, and to transform it into beauty. And hip hop has done that in an amazing way. I had friends who would come into town, and the first thing they wanted to see was like, take me to the Magnolia Projects, or take me to the Fisher. It's like, because they heard it in the songs, they heard it in the music, and they heard how these rappers were uplifting a place that, for many reasons, should have been moments of pain or of frustration, but it became these beacons of like, this is why we are who we are, this is why we love each other, this is our community. And so those are my appreciations of New Orleans hip hop. You know, it's deep. You know what I mean? Like me and D met because of New Orleans music. You know, I heard his first mixtape in college, and I was like, this dude is doing something with this genre I love so much in a way that I got to be connected to him. You know what I mean? Like knowing Freedia's music and understanding like the way it brought us together. You know what I mean? Like Bounce does something here that is just so dynamic. It's hard to explain.
It's
Exactly.
a big part of community here, especially, you know, just all of the different styles of music and what we do and connect together.
Can you restate the question? Those answers were so eloquent, I didn't forgot the question at this point.
It's okay. I was asking really about the uniqueness of New Orleans hip hop, right? And this sound and the bounce culture and the uniqueness of spirituality in New Orleans.
Right.
And what makes this space different in the hip hop sound and the culture in and of itself?
Well, I think that life needs a soundtrack. And in New Orleans, no 2 days are the same. You liable to see any and everything that life can offer by just living down here, by just walking up and down your block on a daily basis. So the music that gets produced from this unique culture and this unique lifestyle, I tell people I feel like I've seen heaven and hell on earth by growing up here in New Orleans, literally. So when you put music to those unique, varied experiences, you get something that doesn't quite sound like anything else, in the field of hip hop. And I just think that people from here, we've often made music from a place of feeling like the underdogs and feeling like there's a sense of celebration, but also desperation at the same time. Like for some of us, it's like we have a lot that we want to celebrate in our hip hop. So you're gonna hear that. You're gonna hear that joy. You're gonna hear that up-tempo bounce that literally you can't help but want to move or just want to groove to a certain tempo to it. But at the same time, I think our songs about pain are something that they just resonate on a deeper level than someone who's trying to replicate some pain. It's like, no, we've really been through this pain. Hurricane Katrina was real. Being the murder capital of the world has been real. Being the most incarcerated state in the United States is real. Unfortunately, they're real. But when you put that into music, I think it just makes for unforgettable hip hop. So that's been my goal as an artist. I didn't want to add to this palette that had been created by No Limit and Cash Money and Take 4 Records, all the big bounce artists from down here. I didn't want to just be a replica of something that came from here. So I was like, well, if I'm gonna jump into this space and represent New Orleans as a hip hop artist, I have to have a lane that's unique and that hasn't been tapped into. And I hadn't heard an artist from New Orleans that was a black man, that was college educated, that was a Christian, that was God-fearing, that was a former teacher, and who still came from the hood and really came from the trenches. I hadn't heard that idea of New Orleans life represented, so I decided to be it.
It's powerful. It's powerful. I want to shift some gears because, and Dee, I think you alluded to that and kind of began to point us in the direction some. Black traditional religious and hip hop communities have historically not been safe spaces for LGBTQIA+ identified individuals and for Black women. Why is that the case? And what role has both institutions played in the subjugation of these communities? Right, that we talked about this on the first panel. It was some of the undercurrent to it, but I want to know what's going on in both communities and the harm that's been done in both communities. Why is there harm there? And I want to move us a step further. What needs to be done to rectify this harm, and how do we begin to do some of that work?
I think whenever a question like this comes up, it could really fill a volume for me as someone who grew up in the Black church and still thinks of the Black church as home, but it is also the place that I've been harmed as a woman, and particularly as a woman in ministry. I often think of the scripture about being wounded in a house of friends. And perhaps that is the greatest hurt, because these are religious spaces that are home because they are the first place that we have articulated our faith and where we have learned what it is to love and to love Blackness well, but it is also the place where there is a continuous silence around women in leadership, women in the pulpit, and just altogether a silence around what should happen next. And I think other communities can speak to this inside of the church, this kind of strange dichotomy that one feels in the place where you are deeply loved, but also you experience multiple harms.
Well, I can piggyback off of, just growing up being a Black queen in a church, surroundings. And so there was moments where I felt like, I was loved by the whole community of the church. And then I felt like there was moments where I was picked on, or I was, the finger was pointed at. So I think that it also breaks down that there was moments where the pastor had to hit on homosexuality and on, on murder and certain subjects that he would preach the sermon on. And, on some of those days, I would feel like the sermon was geared towards me, that he was calling me out amongst the whole church. So, but I also felt like church was my safe haven to get me out of the hood that I lived in, the poverty that I saw, the drugs and the violence that I saw. Church was also that safe haven for me to be able to get out of my house on Josephine. My mom would push us out to the house, to Sunday school. She would push me out to choir rehearsal every chance that we got. She would make sure that I'm in church every Sunday morning. So it's about finding your own balance of your connection with God and your connection with your church home. A lot of times now you see, for me, a lot of these pastors are more accepting than from where I came from. Back then when, I was growing up, homosexuality was whispered about. Now it's more out in the open, it's more bold. You have more supporters and allies for the LGBTQ community. So I think it's just really about finding your safe space in your religion and in your church home. And that's where it really leads to for me, because I see it a lot of times. That was my place though of really my safety net growing up in New Orleans.
I think to kind of jump in and the aspect of the question we were saying, like what are things that we could do to make our spaces safer, is we have to push against harmful theologies, because a lot of how we treat people within our religious spaces are rooted in our belief systems and our understandings of God and God's expectations and the things that we're supposed to do and how we live, and in a lot of respects how we interpret our spiritual text. And sometimes people could get very literal when they look at the text and begin to look at words without proper context. And when we do that, that does leave, as I say, it's that place where like it's a place of that's safe, that's like my home, but my home hurts me, and home shouldn't hurt. And so and you're seeing it more now where people are challenging certain theologies, where people are challenging theologies where you say, well, women aren't supposed to preach from the pulpit. It's Paul said this, well, Jesus said that. Who we rolling with? And beginning to push and have honest conversations and deeper conversations and hear from the margins. A lot of times we know that our church spaces are male-dominated spaces, especially when we talk about leadership, when we talk about the power dynamics, and the same can be said with hip hop. It's a male-dominated space. Like even when we talk about MCs, we make it a point to say women MCs instead of just calling them MCs. They're not, they're MCs. It's MC period. And so when we make these delineations, we're saying that one is greater and the other is lesser. When you have men who may identify as gay. They may identify anywhere on the spectrum, but they don't feel like I can come out in this space, because if I do, then I'm going to be talked about in this space. I'm going to be disrespected in this space. I think something happened with Isaiah Rashad recently, and how that was a whole big controversy, and people made a to-do about it. But it's like, when we talk about keeping it real, if somebody want to live their real life, then are we really mad at somebody for wanting to live their life? Isn't that a core tenet, supposedly? Yeah. So I think that's the thing when we have to have the courage to have deeper conversations, and especially for those of us who have privilege in the space. I understand I'm a cisgender, black, male preacher. I got a whole lot of power, a whole lot of power. If I want to sign up and say I want to pastor a church, my application will probably go ahead of a bunch of women off the strength of me being a man. I have to be at the forefront and challenging that. I think that's something that can do where you have people who have privilege in the space to be very active in the conversation, so making sure that we can be more inclusive, so we can make these spaces that are important in our culture more inclusive and more open, so people can be free. Because that's the goal of it at the end of the day, at least for me, is that I want people should be able to be free in who they are and be able to walk in this world unapologetically. And yeah, I'm gonna stop right there because I'm talking and I got pause.
When you first asked that question, I wanted to quote Bell Hooks, like, why are we having this? I was like, white supremacist, imperialist, capitalist, patriarchy. Like, that's why we're dealing with this, right? And then I wanted to quote Yassine Bey, also known as Mo Steph. People ask, well, how hip hop is doing? Well, how are we doing, right? And so I think like the parallels between the ways in which hip hop and religious spaces, and even in Muslim religious spaces, like the issues are different, or like the structures are different, right? But there is still this, this way in which women do get harmed, right? There's a space of harm. There's still sort of questions around LGBTQA, there's still these kind of resistances and this kind of thing that happen as well. And where people are, I'm Muslim, and they're gonna do what they do, right? And they're gonna continue to participate, but they're carving space out for themselves, kind of going against the grain, right? And I think that, why this happens is because of the ways in which, right, these systems that shouldn't be in, you would think like hip hop, right? And like religious spaces, they shouldn't govern, right? These systems shouldn't govern that because of the origins of those spaces, but they very much do, right? And what you were saying in terms of identifying your power and privilege in spaces, like, black men, like black Muslim men identify, like, I mean, please, right? It's like, you try to, they're like, I'm not like, they will respond to you like, you act like I'm a white man, right? And it's like, dude, right? You're not a white man, but in this space, right, and in our community, because you're a male, right, particularly cisgender male, you have a lot of power, right? And until you are ready to identify and recognize that, the problems we have are going to continue, right? And so I think kind of having that kind of analysis, and really, I guess even going back to knowledge of self, really sort of having a sense of like how this happened, right? How we're embroiled in it, is that's the only way we're going to get out of it. If people are still like pretending like, it's not really that bad, or that's not what I meant, or you misunderstood me. You know what I mean? Like, if people aren't really to be accountable, and then also being held accountable, right? So like the men who need to hold other men accountable, right? So it's cool that you cool.
Yeah.
But old boy over there, you need to grab him up and get him together, right? So I think that's also a part of kind of what needs to happen.
I agree. That accountability, I'm glad you touched on that, because I was gonna say first and foremost in hip hop, we owe collectively, we owe women and we owe the LGBTQ community a huge apology for decades of just atrocities and wrongness that has been spewed towards both of them. The issue is, moving forward, I feel like in terms of trying to right those wrongs, there's a difference. I don't think that there's as blatant a level of disrespect towards the LGBTQ community inside hip hop at this moment as there is towards women still. So it's like, well, why do rappers perpetually still choose to disrespect women, but people kind of know like, oh, you better not say that word, or oh, you better not say that publicly in terms of the LGBTQ community. And I think the difference is that the running narrative is, oh, they don't play. If you disrespect them at this point, you finna get canceled, or you.
They coming.
Yeah, they coming. But with women, it's like
well, some of them are upset, maybe at the misogyny or the disrespectful language, but most of them dancing to the music. Most of them consuming the music. So it's not really a fear that artists have. And when I say artists, I'm pointing at myself, but I ain't talking about myself. But it's not a fear that artists have of like, man, no, you better really stop disrespecting these women, you know, in your music and whatnot. That fear isn't there. And that fear, I think, ceases to be there because, unfortunately, I don't think women are unified around the narrative of being sick and tired of being disrespected. That's why I love that woman right there, because she, from day one, has come out as an artist, and you knew what she stood for, and she makes it appealing. Our job as artists is to make the movement irresistible. Whatever that movement is that you represent, is to make it irresistible through your craft and through your talent and through your style and your beauty. And I just don't think that there's enough fans or artists who have unified around the idea of like, nah, this disrespect towards women is really finna stop. I think it's too much of a fractured front to where that really doesn't happen. So that's why we see the disrespect continuing, and it's gonna continue, unfortunately.
I think, you know, they have to, it's a community effort where everybody has to put, you know, their foot down and say when is enough is enough.
Right.
You know, it won't stop because everybody want to follow the trends. A lot of these rappers don't have nothing to talk about but disrespect to women.
Yep.
So unless a lot of other artists stand up and say, well, when are we gonna stop disrespecting black women or women in general on songs? It's gonna just keep on happening. It's gonna be a reoccurring thing that's gonna keep on just going over and over and over until enough people stand up and say, all right, you know, we gotta hit the gavel now.
So I guess
Literally.
I wanna, because if the music is a reflection of what's happening in life, the deeper question is what we doing in real life. Like, and I think that's where like, what is our larger communal conversation? Because what I'm hearing is like the burden has to go on women to fix the problem,
And this is like,
which should not be the case. I mean, we can say like, more often than not, black women have been carrying black people for now and ever.
Forever.
Right, you know what I'm saying? And it's like, in a lot of respects, it's like, it shouldn't be like, I'll say it like this, we've heard enough black women throughout time and space say, yo, stop disrespecting us. Stop, things are happening to us. We're being raped in the streets, we're being raped in our homes, we're being molested and hurt in our families. People have been saying this. The problem is folks ain't been listening. Like, it ain't, the people have been talking. The question becomes, when will we take it serious? I think, and this is deeper than music now. This is like in real time, real space, real life. I mean, I think, and I'm gonna credit a lot of the women in my life for putting me on game. Like, more often than not, a lot of the women that we interact with have probably been molested, assaulted on some level. And probably, and when you hear them tell their stories, you're like, well, like, what more can, like, what can I do? Because I know in my, like, accountability, me and my homies, we shut stuff down real quick. You don't even be talking like that. You need, If we see something happen within their own relationship, like, bro, dog, you tripping, you wrong. Like, and we figuring out how to make things better. So we do it in our own spaces, then trying to figure out how do we have this larger conversation, but I don't think it's like this one thing where women have to do more. I mean, we had a whole Me Too movement. I mean, like, we had a whole movement. You can't get much louder than that when you see in a women's march with hundreds of thousands of women saying, yo, these things are happening to us. What more do we want? And so it's like, at that point, the question becomes, do we just not care?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the oppression and silencing and marginalization of women is attributed to, you know, white male oppression of black people. And then when we talk about it as women, it's like, oh, you're attacking the black man, you're attacking the black family. Your opinion is being dictated by this larger white feminist narrative. Whereas we actually have valid examples and valid experiences of being abused, of being disrespected, and all of these things. So I think that a lot of times our voices are silenced in that way. It's not that we're not speaking about it. It's not that we aren't unified in that when we see an example of oppression, when we see an example of denigration of black women or someone who's spewing that, we don't speak out about it. But when we do, it's like, well, no, you're just spewing, something that is contrary to what our culture deems to be a part of like Black culture and the construct of the Black family. And I'm like, and once we're able to have those conversations and once we're listened to in that way, and like a lot of the, you know, the brothers on the panel and have said, you know, there needs to be accountability, you know, we need to look at ourselves and make sure not only we're giving the space giving the women the space to listen, but also really think about how you're internalizing this larger, you know, cultural narrative that finds its way, that is able to permeate into, you know, cultures like hip hop, you know, and permeate into other facets of this macrocosm. Part of the reason why a lot of women within hip hop in particular are still being silenced and marginalized and erased in many ways from the conversation about, you know, abuse of women and oppression and suppression of women's voices is that oftentimes when we do speak about it, we're often criticized for some betrayal of Black men or Black family, and we are told that we are aligning ourselves with this idea of white feminism, and that is, in contrast to, you know, what Black family and Black culture is, and that was, you know, and so because of that, our very valid concerns are mischaracterized as our own internalized ideas about what it means to be, what it means to hold the Black family down or like be loyal to Black culture. And it's difficult to have that conversation when, you know, you are, absolutely for the upholding of the Black family, you're absolutely wanting to elevate, you know, Black voices, and, you know, you love Black men, but you want to call them to task for their behaviors. And I think that, you know, a lot of people on the panel spoke about the need for accountability, and then the need for allowing Black women to have like the spaces and the platform to speak freely about this without being maligned as, you know, being a perpetrator of the larger, you know, white male, you know, patriarchy, the agenda of the white male patriarchy to tear down the Black family. And then also for Black women within the space of hip hop to support one another in what we're doing. And that, like, so for me, it's very important for me to, you know, I say Goddess gang gang, you know, talking about like the importance of women empowering each other and taking up space, and even with our differences in philosophies and the way that we express, you know, we are, as we always have been, on the front lines of leading the culture forward. And we are demanding that space, we're demanding that, you know, space for expression. So it's a very complex and, you know, conversation that speaks to both sides needing to just assess whether we are being true to ourselves, honestly looking at ourselves and the roles that we play in these spaces.
I feel like when you look at the LGBTQ community, one thing you see is unity regardless of whatever background there is. And I feel like if, like what everyone has said, but if the moment women do really unify against being hurt, to be honest, I just think that we would see an immediate change. I think it is also about what do we support, you know? You know, we have artists out there and males who are allies to women, but they don't have a louder voice than what's being pushed mainstream. And I think it all does root back to the rich white man in the suit. That's what is pushed forward to us. It's funny how what Sa-Roc was saying about, oh, you think you're attacking the Black man and blah, 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 but it's like, actually, I'm actually attacking that which is in control of pushing what's mainstream to us. Our message in hip hop has been infiltrated. You know, back in the day, like from slavery, we used to have messages in music that were critical that they couldn't even understand. And, you know, once money's involved in anything that we have that's really good, it usually gets taken over. And we went from telling our story or telling stuff that was going on to promoting it. And that's the good and the bad. And it seems to be the bad more at the forefront. And when it comes to women, there's no genre on this planet that talks about women like ours.
That's not true.
That's not true. You don't think so?
Okay, so what?
I think we the only race that profits off of killing each other.
I've never heard bitch, hoe, slut, trick, bitch, from like over and over again, like incantations. I could probably name one rock song, but I'm talking about as far as the majority, forefront. I just feel like what genre talks about women and shows women in the way that hip hop does? Which one?
I mean, I think you have popular pop music, country music, rock music. All of it does the same thing, and I think we feel it more profoundly because it comes out of our community. But I don't think hip hop is unique in that way. I think at all, actually, right? But I think we feel it in a different kind of way because it comes to the community and because, right, of the history that we have. So I just don't agree with that point about hip hop being unique in that way.
Okay.
And also, I feel like, and I want to go back to I think what you had said about, I don't know, this LGBTQ and women comparison doesn't feel super analogous to me. Like it's appropriate to kind of make that kind of thing because of the histories around. Right, just it feels like it's kind of like apples and oranges on some level, and the idea that women just get together. I mean, like, women are together. I mean, like today, I guess I can't say today anyway, but right, well, no, what's happening, right, in terms of like abortion? Women are like everywhere. Women are together, so I don't think it's like women are not doing enough to protest enough.
I feel like if women decided we are not dealing with any men who wear blue, Crips would change their color. I feel like we have that power.
Is that power or manipulation?
I feel like it's power. We are everything. I believe we're mother civilization, and I just do believe we do have the power to hold the planet accountable for stuff that we want to hold them accountable for, in my opinion.
Go ahead. I want to take something about women, and it's the whole question of this dialogue about intersectionality. First of all, just as we were talking about race, it is not incumbent upon Black people to solve the race problem. It is not incumbent upon women to solve that problem in hip hop. The second thing, I think the challenge with women, we all have multiple voices. We do not have the same experiences, so we're not a monolith. We're not a monolith in experiences and the voices that we have. But I think the onus is men standing up and listening to what we have to say and seeing us in the full humanity of who we are. We're women, we're Black women. And, part of that, there are a lot of people doing their own work. I think also the complicated nature about this, and I've been thinking a lot about this, and I was talking to Emmett earlier about the visual in hip hop, where I think is a game changer, and images, and someone has said something, the women are out there dancing. Women find their freedom in different ways. And we haven't even talked about sexuality and how they express themselves. The same things we say that are objectifying, some other women may see it as liberating. So, I just want us to be careful about, lumping us all together. There's just as much of an individual expression and experience, but I do think men, people have to step up. The voices are out there. I don't know what the game changer is, but the thing I've learned about studying this music, as much as that is a collective freedom, it is all about individual freedom as well. And that's what's due to every living human being.
Right.
And that is part of that too, that we have to respect that and acknowledge it and work with that.
Yeah, and I just feel like collectively, regardless of our background, as a woman, you shouldn't want another woman harmed or objectified, or to be honest, even simply just, you're constantly calling me a bitch, a hoe, a slut, and trick. You know, like, why is that the only thing you're calling me? You know what I'm saying? Or if I see myself mainstream, this is the only, especially Black women, we're so multifaceted, we're so dynamic, but mainstream, I'm only seeing one type of mood. And that is kind of blasphemy because we're so everything. So it's just like, you know, where's the balance? Where's the different, you know?
To the point of women not being, Black women not being a monolith, I think we have to be honest with ourselves about who we are catering to. You know, we talk about the, you know, white gaze, but what about the male gaze, and who are running these industries?
Right.
Who is rewarding this particular form of expression, this particular narrative?
Good question.
Who's rewarding that?
Good question.
And we've heard women, and I don't want to, you know, call out the name, but we've heard women rappers who've said,
yeah,
I wanted to pivot to something else, but
And I
that
did no
didn't sell.
support.
So I'm going to go back to this, which is what I know sells and which is
Yep.
what I know my label is going to push and promote. So that's why I said the onus, yes, is not on women to change, but we do need to be engaged in transforming this landscape. And we do need to also be honest with ourselves at how much of it is agency, how much of it is our own like liberation and our own freedom to express ourselves in the way we want to express ourselves, and how much of it is beholden to this larger industry that is not controlled by us. I think that it needs to be a part of the honest conversation, but the larger responsibility does fall on those who are in the dominant positions, which are men, you know?
Those who have the power.
Those who have the power.
Those who have the power. I
Exactly.
mean, I think that's my thing is like, we can't, and I appreciate what you said about like with Black people, like no one would be like, oh, we just, well actually that's not true. I guess people do say that. If Black people just got it together, we would do that. But that's not true, right? Like it's not like Black people, I mean, since people of African descent have arrived in the Americas, they have fought, right? The first like slave revolt, right, in the Americas was on the Christopher Columbus's son's plantation. I mean, if that's not like perfect, right? And that was like what, 1520 something, right? People always fighting, right? Always fighting, always resisting. So it's not for lack of fighting, right? And so there is a power imbalance, and that we want to make the power balance. But I feel like, you know, this thing about women, I think, you know, if I have to make a choice, if I know that this sells and this doesn't, then that means I'm in a disempowered position, right? That's the nature of me making that kind of choice. So therefore it's like, well, so building power is something that maybe more important than building some kind of fictive unity.
Right? I think we should just stop going back and forth then, because what one person calls oppression, another person calls expression. And if there's always this blurry line of like, well, is it even disrespect? You know, this woman is dancing and she's being liberated to this music, even if the words are calling her out of her name. If it's like, well, no, that's her right to express herself and that's liberating to her. But then if another woman is like, those same lyrics are like extremely disrespectful to me and I would never want to hear that and I would never dance to that. And if it's like, well, she's not wrong, but she's not wrong either for wanting to dance to it, then it's just like we should just stop arguing, because it's really nothing to debate if it's always an ambiguous definition of, is it disrespect or is it an opportunity to express yourself? And that definition of what that agency looks like inside of hip hop, that's the problem. The only thing that I have heard that I'm just like, I really can't agree with is that as Black people, we're not responsible for fixing what's wrong with our community at this point. I just can't get with that, because whether or not we started it, if we continue to have what I believe is a victim mentality and say, well, we didn't start this, we didn't bring ourselves here, we didn't do this, so it's not on us. Same thing with women. Oh, well, we're not the ones who are in power. Listen, as an independent artist, which is running hip hop nowadays, by the way, it's no longer the age of you have to be signed to a major label and only 5 songs are popular because they're on the radio. Man, forget that. This is 2022. As an independent artist, when you go in the booth and you come up with these lyrics to your song and you put that out, there are no middlemen between the music you create and the message that gets out there to your fans. So if you're going in there and if you're cursing women out and disrespecting women and whatnot, we can't say that's on the white man anymore. We can't.
But even that is controlled though. Like if we think about the independent artists and now having access to these platforms where we don't have to go through a middleman to stream our music or whatever, we're finding out now that these streaming farms are being controlled, that industries are paying YouTube, they're paying these other streaming platforms to increase the streams, increase the views, and then if you speak out about certain things, the algorithm on these social media platforms will shut you down, will silence you. So and I'm not saying that it's a no-win situation. That's why I was saying that women also need to be actively engaged in transforming the landscape. The same thing with Black people in terms of being, taking control of shifting our experience, our environment, and changing our future, for sure. But we can't ignore that there are these behemoths that whichever way that we try to find agency, they will insert themselves and control that narrative. I mean, it is a fact.
I mean, NBA Youngboy is not getting played on any mainstream radio. He's not on hardly any playlists on Spotify, on Apple Music, but he is the voice of an entire generation because he goes directly to his consumer, and it's not algorithms, it's not mainstream. How does he do it? YouTube.
And YouTube is algorithm.
But YouTube is also driven by people's search preferences, and trust and believe that these kids, because I was a teacher, so I see my nephews, they're in school right now, these kids are drawn to this brother. Instagram, same thing. Instagram has an algorithm, but there is popular opinion that feeds into the algorithm. As fans, now oftentimes we look at ourselves as creators, but as fans have to take accountability for what they are consuming, because at the end of the day, we can't sit back and say, well, I'm only consuming this because this is what is popular. There's nothing else being offered. There's everything being offered now. If you want Christian hip hop, if you want conscious hip hop, if you want positive hip hop, if you want hip hop from a homosexual, if you want gangster rap, it's all out there. So at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves, what do we have a taste for? Same thing, McDonald's might run more commercials than Whole Foods does, but Whole Foods still exists. And the knowledge that it exists gives you the power to go and choose it if you want to.
But you can't afford Whole Foods.
You can't, but you can afford a free stream of D1 or Kendrick Lamar or J. Cole.
Here's the thing, but I think it's not a zero-sum game here, right? Yeah. So the idea that we identify that there are huge structural realities that get in the way every time you try to advance is not a victim mentality. It is an awareness and it's a sophisticated analysis of what you're dealing with. And so then you build strategy based on that. And it doesn't mean that individuals lose any kind of responsibility for what they do, but it does mean that we have to really be honest about how, right, a variety of social forces shapes, right, and shapes, and it's very hard to go against the grain. And that's true even if it's a good grain, right? Like it's hard to do that because everything around you is encouraging you this way. So to kind of swerve, right, is a hard thing to do, right? So I think identifying that difficulty is not a victim blaming. Identifying that difficulty is just being real about what's happening, and then you build strategy accordingly, right? Mm-hmm. And so I don't know the streams of who you're talking about, but I do know, and I think there's a lot of research and Black people research about the ways in which, like, even when you search something, right, in one part of the country, you'll get this thing pop up. In another part of the country, this will come up, right? Even when you're searching. So and again, it doesn't mean that maybe I should be searching for something, right? But it does mean that there is a very real, like, hill that we're climbing. And I don't think that's a victim mentality to identify that.
So I'm going to move us, and I hate to do this, but we are running out of time, and I want to give an opportunity to kind of bring us full circle. We needed like another hour maybe, but another day. But I want to ask this question and pose it to you all as kind of this it's not a wrap-up, because this is a continuous conversation that we continuously need in the community and between these two entities, right? But what is the legacy of hip hop and faith? Right? When we're thinking about moving forward, when we're thinking about pushing forward and redefining and uprooting some things, what is the legacy of these two institutions? And one could say that they're not even separate, that they're they're in and of the same, right? But what is the legacy of them for this community and for our community, but also the legacy of hip hop and faith for the larger world, right? Because hip hop is global, right? Faith is global, right? So it moves beyond this space. So I want to give everybody an opportunity who desires to kind of close us up on how you feel and what do you feel is the legacy of that. And I'll start with you, Neelam. Or whoever wants to jump in first. Look, I won't put you on the spot. Whoever wants to jump in first and ready.
I can just say that I'm hopeful that the legacy of hip hop is, just a true upliftment for everyone, and that, I don't know, honestly, just anything that's top echelon, that's good and improves as far as the Black community, our lives, that would be awesome.
I would say that the legacy is this conversation, because this conversation doesn't pre-exist without the tensions. And I think that hip hop and where we are in terms of Black faith allows us both the privilege and the platform to actually talk about the tensions. So we may not agree on resolutions, although resolutions have been proposed, but at least the tensions are being aired out in a way where we can actually own and honor those things and acknowledge that those tensions exist rather than sweeping them under the carpet and ignoring them, which has happened generation upon generation and generation. I think the other thing about legacy is that hip hop has been a transitional and transformative power that has empowered our young people in ways and shapes that we, as older folks, may not have imagined that. So it gives a lingua franca, it gives a posture, it gives a sense of ownership, it gives a sense of entrepreneurialism, it gives a sense of artistry and creativity that didn't previously exist. If you were going to play jazz, you needed to know how to play that instrument to a level of excellence. In order to be a participant within hip hop culture, there are multiple inroads, there are multiple on-ramps onto that conversation, which is not just music. And I think that if we open that conversation up to dance and to art and to all kinds of other expressions, hip hop swag, I think it creates opportunities that didn't previously exist. And I think the power of hip hop is also that we don't have to figure it out. I don't think that that was hip hop's original intention. Hip hop's original intention was to mark something that wasn't being heard and to acknowledge something that wasn't being seen. And I think hip hop has continually done that. I think we do have a responsibility to take those things now that they have been heard and seen and felt, to do something with them that is productive, that does help the next generation to be better and to be more empowered than previous generations. But I think the legacy is that we're still here. After all these, decades, what was supposed to be a passing fad of some young kids who had too much energy and too much aggression now is a stable game changer in the world. That's legacy.
This kind of piggybacks off of what Emmett said. It's hard for me to think of legacy when something is still evolving. At the same time, I think we're in a really important moment in the history of African Americans, the African diasporic peoples in this country. And that excites me. I see a world that didn't exist when I was a teenager, a possibility of stretching beyond boundaries that, everyone's struggle, they get so far, and then something else opens up the door. And I think what hip hop has given us the opportunity to have these hard conversations that we need to have in order to, forge a new way forward. Because ideally what we're dealing is, we're all seeking freedom in a system that was built to oppress us. That's the challenge, that's been the age-old challenge throughout history, negotiating that and trying to figure out what you have to do to be able to do something else. And the way we get it right is that we listen, that we learn, and this is cross generations of what hip hop has opened us, and we open ourselves to have some of these hard conversations that we haven't been wanting to have, but really to look at what's working and open up a way forward so that we can all experience what it has to offer. I mean, the whole thing about hip hop and culture and fashion, that's always been there, but this is the first time it's been really articulated and described and talked about. This is a learning opportunity and as well as a way, if we do it right, of opening the world in a way that has not happened over the last 400 years.
Thanks. Freedia, I'm going to come to you. What do you think is the legacy? And Brandon, I will come back to you.
You know, I think the legacy is, you know, the continued growth of hip hop. You know, us continuing to grow to different heights. You know, I want to see hip hop keep on growing into the LGBTQ community and opening doors for other artists like myself. And really just being able to expand the evolution of the music. You know, you have all of these new generation of kids that will be coming. And so you will be setting the new tone for hip hop for years to come. You know, I see a lot of these younger new rappers who are out there with new styles of hip hop and new delivery. And so it's gonna keep on evolving into, you know, different generations and different people and different styles. And that's what I wanna keep on seeing. It grow until, you know, forever.
Brandon.
Yes, sir. I remember hearing a preacher say, he was like, he said the black church is like Noah's Ark. It stinks in here, but it's flooding out there. And so I think the overlap between hip hop and black faith is survival technology. I think the legacy, years and years to come, when someone asks, how did black people survive? They're gonna look at hip hop, they're gonna look at black faith, and they're gonna be like, oh, that's how they did it. And that's what I feel it is.
Funny enough, I'm gonna build off of that, because I would say the word that came to mind for me was resiliency. That's the word that came, because I think that's just been the story of black folk. From like, if I mark it from the time that we were brought over here, we've really learned how to make ways out of no ways. We had to create a whole new culture for us to be able to survive in the wilderness, to be able to navigate this space as community. And we've found different ways throughout the course of our time here to be resilient in the face of oppression. And when we look at our musical forms through that, whether you talk about spirituals, when you talk about having coded songs to get you to freedom, when you have spirituals to talk about your relationship with God, when you talk about the blues to talk about the oppression that you're going through, but still finding a way to have a good time while you're going through it. When you talk about jazz, when you talk about soul music, and then you get to hip hop, it's like with everything that's been thrown at us, somehow, some way, we still here. And we ain't going nowhere. I think from that resiliency, that's the legacy. Now it's a matter of just how do we move from survival to thriving, to now overthrowing systems of oppression in a lot of respects, because tired of that shit, to be frankly honest, because when you dealing with your mom having to deal with sitting on the back of a bus because she looked a certain way 40, 50 years ago, to even now, we still dealing with laws that are physically in place to be able to tell people that you can't do this and you can't do that, but yet and still, we still here doing our thing. And so my hope is that on that legacy of resilience that it can eventually turn into this space where we just thriving in the most beautiful ways, where these oppressive systems ain't on our neck, that we done broke the chain in a very real way, you know.
Man. I mean, I think that the legacy of hip hop, and along with that spirituality, black spirituality, because it's so intertwined in many ways, is, you know, as it's always been, tremendous cultural shifts, the ability to predict or lead us into the future, a future of hope, a future of possibility and change. And the Black church, you know, the masjids and other forms of Black spirituality as it has shown up in our communities, as well as hip hop, has always been at the forefront of our resistance movement, has always been at the forefront of us shifting conversations, shifting eras, becoming liberated. You know, we might fall back a couple steps, but it's always going to be moving us, propelling us forward, as long as we're using our voices to amplify ourselves in a very authentic way. And I think the longevity of hip hop has shown us that it's here to stay. Its global influence has shown us it's possible of massive worldwide change, and I think that's what's going to be its legacy for sure.
The legacy of hip hop and Black faith, that's a difficult question. You know, I don't remember where I heard this first, but I really like it, the idea that liberation is a journey, not a destination. And so I feel like in that framework, the legacy of hip hop and Black faith has been the soundtrack to that journey, right? I think it is the means through which we kind of think about, we relate to, we debate about, we argue, we disagree about. Like, I think it becomes a means for that to get there, right? Because it's something we have to build. Like, I mean, in many ways, I think it was maybe Lewis Gordon, the philosopher, I think it was, who was like, you know, talking about specifically about the United States. He was saying, you know, we have to imagine a world that the founders couldn't even dream of, right? We're not trying to like make that better. We're not trying to get that together, right? We have to imagine completely outside the realm of possibility for the people who created this settler colony, right? So likewise, I think hip hop really is about that kind of Black radical imagination and sort of helping us. I feel like that when hip hop and Black faith come together, that is the legacy that I see.
The legacy of hip hop and Black faith. Wow. I think that the legacy remains to be seen. I think that it's hard to say what the legacy is. I think that in terms of what the legacy should be, is that hopefully Black faith pulls out the best of us to where it literally extracts, you know, the best of what exists inside of us. And through our faith, we grow a closer connection with God. And if that's what Black faith is all about, is pulling out the best of us and forming a closer connection with God, then hopefully hip hop can be a conduit and a vehicle to help that expression and that connection to God take place on a more intimate level. So if hip hop is being used in a manner that is enhancing Black faith in God, then I think it's great. I think just like with anything, if hip hop is used for the wrong purpose, then it may put the legacy in jeopardy of hip hop and Black faith. Just like David had the power to use that slingshot to defeat Goliath, but he also had an equal amount of power to where he could have used that slingshot to start throwing rocks at his own people. So if we use hip hop for the wrong purpose, hip hop could actually do more harm in our community than good. So hopefully the legacy of hip hop and Black faith will be that hip hop has catapulted Black faith to where they're both stronger at the end.
Thank you.
I guess I would say if legacy is to indicate how will we remember best hip hop and Black religion, I would say that it should be remembered as a house with many mirrors. Both of them gave us multiple ways of seeing Black people, Black cultures, particularly in a society and given a history that it disallowed that for Black folk. That we figured out ways to create multiple identities, ways of seeing ourselves, and to imagine new futures. I think of those as the spaces in which that occurred. And also, hip hop allows us to see Black religion differently, and Black religion allows us to articulate hip hop in some very unique ways. And if ever there is this kind of fugitive work, I think that's really it, because that is the escape. That's the way out of no way that we have always found and used hip hop and Black religion to do that. So I think that's the biggest legacy that we'll have for those two together.
When I think about Black faith specifically, it's something that Black people have really infused into their struggles. Whatever their struggle was, they used their faith to really make sense of it, to work through it, and to overcome it. And so you talk to people and they'll say, for example, that opposing racism is an essential part of their faith. Like, this is what it means to be a good Christian, what it means to be a good Muslim, is to oppose racism. But then if you think about the legacy and the way things have changed over time, increasingly Black people, and especially younger Black people, are saying opposing sexism, opposing gender discrimination is also essential to their faith, essential to what being Christian means to them. But then you get into the power dynamics that we've talked about a little bit, and they say, I don't hear that from the pulpit. I don't hear sermons about that. I don't hear sermons about opposing sexism, opposing gender discrimination. And so people are going to look to someplace to hear messages that speak to them, to hear messages that relate to their issues. And for some people, that's the preacher and their preaching. And for some people, that's the traditional gospel music. But then for some folks, it's hip hop. And it's going to feed that same soul, feed that same need, to hear their pain recognized, to see a way forward, and to be able to keep moving, even in the face of those difficulties, in the face of that hurt.
Awesome. I could sit here another hour with you all, and we could talk probably another 3 hours, really, about all these topics. But one, we're out of time. So one, I want to thank each and every one of you for sitting around the table, for breaking bread together and talking about something that I believe we will continue to talk about for years to come. Again, to follow along with the conversation, you can go online and to NMAAHC, follow us on Twitter, follow us on Facebook, follow us on YouTube. Use the hashtag Smithsonian Hip Hop, God Talk, and Black Faith. I'm Teddy Reeves, and this has been a delight to welcome you into another God Talk episode. Join us at the museum anytime. We would love to have you there. Good night.
Hip hop to me is the trendsetter, the standard bearer and the salt of the planet Earth.
Hip hop for me is one of the most powerful tools of expression and storytelling that we have as a culture, as a people.
Hip hop is self-expression. It's Black. It's the culture. It's love. It's the struggle. It's pain. It's joy. It's art. It's creativity. It's everything and then some.
Hip hop to me is alchemy. One of our GOATs, Juvenile, said, "Do you know what it is to turn nothing into something?" That's what hip hop is. It's a process of turning nothing into something.
So hip hop is an extension of my life. Hip hop is what has given me the opportunity to express myself in ways that conversation can't. Hip hop has spoken to me in ways that church couldn't. It's spoken to me in ways that teachers couldn't. Hip hop was just something that I was able to translate in my life to teach me the things I needed to become the